Hi, Misha here, and I've been covering the fighter aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and talked about the Type 1 Oscar, the Ki-43, and the Type 2 Tojo, the Ki-44. And now, what comes after 1 and 2? Of course, we get to the Army Type 3 fighter, the Ki-61, known in Japan as the Swallow. The Allies first called it Mike, and then later Tony. Both names really because of a bit of a misunderstanding or honestly just underestimation of Japanese industry. This fighter interceptor is unique in that it's one of the few inline liquid cool engine planes used in the Japanese Army Air Force. And instead of being designed by Nakajima, this was designed by Kawasaki. And this plane's design dates back to 1939 when the Army specified two new fighter interceptors. One would be a heavily armed dedicated interceptor, and the other would be a more lightly armed, more maneuverable fighter interceptor. The pure interceptor would evolve into the Ki-60, and the fighter interceptor would evolve into this plane, the Ki-61. And priority was given to the Ki-60, and both were to use a Kawasaki license-built version of a German liquid-cooled engine known in Japan as the HA-40. Again, making them quite unique from the radial engines they typically used. And with giving the Ki-60 priority, it would first fly in April of 1941, with the Ki-61 prototype not flying until December of 1941. But the trick is, the Ki-60 was a failure, whereas the Ki-61 had attributes that pilots liked. And this was unique for Japanese planes, in that it was designed from the outset with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, an armored headrest, bulletproof windscreen, and heavier armament of 12.7mm machine guns. It also had a higher maximum altitude of over 38,000 feet compared with the over 36,000 feet of the Type 1 and Type 2. Had a little bit slower climb rate than the Ki-44. And it was a little bit slower overall with a max speed of about 360 miles per hour, but still respectable enough considering its armor. And like other later planes, it could carry up to two 550-pound bombs or drop tanks. And honestly, pre-production models or even late prototypes were first used in April of 1942 to try to defend the Japanese homeland against the Doolittle raid of B-25s. And this was the first time the Allies would encounter the Ki-61. At this time, they either thought it was a German BF.109 or a Japanese copy of a BF.109, hence the original reporting name of Mike. Later, they would think it was a copy of an Italian C-202, and thus the reporting name was changed to Tony, which stuck. However, while they saw combat in April of 1942, they did not really enter into full production until the end of that year. The problems were that the HA-40 engine required pretty precise manufacturing, pretty high-grade materials, pretty tight tolerances that the Japanese factories were sometimes having a hard time achieving in 1942. Also, while it was a perfectly acceptable engine in 1939 and 1940 when originally specified, by 1942 it was looking underpowered. So they would look into an updated version known as the HA-140, but this was even less reliable and even more difficult to manufacture, so problems. But by 1943, the Ki-61 started to be deployed in sizable numbers, first being used in the New Guinea campaign, really seeing use in August and September, and it was there at Rabaul in November of 1943. And honestly did a whole lot of nothing. I mean, it was there. It proved to be quite a good plane, at least compared to early war designs. For example, after the original prototypes were flown, the Army was concerned about its heavy, high wing loading and lack of maneuverability. So Kawasaki organized a demonstration, putting it up against the Ki-43 Oscar, as well as a captured P-40 Warhawk, and even a Soviet Lavochkin La-GG-3. And of the planes, the Ki-61 was the fastest, and it was really only second in maneuverability to the Oscar. But again, these are pretty early war planes. Obviously, as newer planes came along, it was getting more and more outclassed. Even if it was decent, it had armor protection, as the Allies used 50 caliber guns or even 20mm cannon, its armor was starting to show as insufficient. Also, its own 12.7mm cannon were not as good as they could have been. End result was, by the end of 1943, the Japanese Army had lost a lot of planes. We're talking 2,000 plus all told. So it was pretty brutal on them. Nevertheless, the Ki-61 was just getting started. In 1944, as the war turned decidedly against the Japanese, the Ki-61 started to really be used in its intended role as an interceptor. This is when it met the B-29. They would do what they could to improve reliability and performance, again changing around the engine. They would also fix the formerly retracting tail wheel in a down position just because they had so many problems with the mechanism. And also going up against the more modern B-29, the armament had to be upgraded. Originally this had two 7.7 mil machine guns and two 12.7mm 50 caliber machine guns. For a time there would be four 12.7mm machine guns, but then they would start integrating a couple of different makes of 20mm cannon, and they would even build a few with 30mm cannon in the wings. While these were used as pure interceptors and even fighters all the way through the end of the war, there were more than a few aces that had at least a dozen kills to their name in these. The Tony became well known for ramming attacks against B-29s mostly. The first ramming occurred in August of 1944, at least the one on record, and there may or may not have been accidental. It certainly wasn't intended from the outset. But this quickly proved to be an effective tactic against the B-29s. So in November of 1944, it was made official Japanese Army Air Force policy, where volunteers could sign up for special attack squadrons to do just that, essentially kamikaze, but with one difference. The kamikazes were never expected to live. Their planes are loaded down with bombs and usually flown into ships. But with the special attack units of the Army Air Force, they were actually expected to ram the plane with their plane, and if possible, either land their plane or parachute out and then do it all over again. The men that volunteered were basically reusable kamikaze. They were hoped that they could do this a few times and would just keep doing it. They were considered doomed men, dead men walking. Basically, Japanese Jem'Hadar. They were already dead. They went into battle to reclaim their life, that kind of thing. Only they weren't. And the only escape was either death, or if they were just so severely injured that they could no longer fly a plane. In that December, the Emperor actually started giving out special medals to these pilots that would ram B-29s. So it was very not just publicly acknowledged, but even celebrated in Japan coming into 1945. They would even, sometimes if they could, display damaged or wrecked Tonys in public squares and public areas with an accounting of the B-29 they hit and knocked out of the sky. Kind of an interesting footnote there. They really never did get the engine as reliable as they wanted, and of course, late war, the quality of labor went way down, the quality of the pilots went way down, and not surprisingly, Japan was suffering from not having good aviation fuel and not having good metal and other fine resources. Nevertheless, they kept making these, and they built over 3,000. So, quite a bit more than the Ki-44. And again, it is unique in Japanese fighters for being a liquid-cooled engine. It had higher altitude performance, and again, 20 or even in a few cases 30mm cannon. And it showed that, hey, they weren't oblivious to the benefits of self-sealing fuel tanks, which is why this plane, while not at all perfect, didn't go up like a Christmas tree if you hit it with one .22 caliber round. It actually had some armor. It was kind of thin by the standards of late war, but some is always better than none, especially when you're talking fuel tanks. And it had otherwise quite good performance. The downside was it was just technically complicated to manufacture, and Japanese ground techs always seem to have more trouble maintaining liquid-cooled engines versus air-cooled engines, Navy or Air Force. So it certainly was not perfect. But it's an interesting plane. Whether you call it the Swallow, Mike, or Tony. And fits right in with the Japanese Army Air Force. And with that, next time we'll get to the 4th. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. I'll catch you very soon next time.